Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. And to do that, we take burning issues of the day, what's going on in the world, and we apply libertarian principles to get more of a sense of how we present this uncompromising case for libertarianism. Come to our website at fff.org. I'm joined, as I am every week for the Libertarian Angle, by my co-host, an uncompromising libertarian himself, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be back with you and our viewers and listeners to deal with another burning issue of the day, as you said.
Yeah, one of the burning issues is what's going on in Korea. It's really, I find it absolutely fascinating. You've got the Winter Olympics there, but you know, rather than just a sports event, it's been converted into this gigantic political event where everybody's maneuvering and posturing, and specifically with respect to the crisis in Korea, the North Koreans sent down what they call or what the press is calling the Army of Beauties, which is really I find it a fascinating phenomenon. I mean, all these young women, all dressed the same, which of course is what you would expect from a totalitarian country, all singing these songs in unison that are sort of like semi-patriotic songs, and they were sent down as sort of like a diplomatic corps to kind of highlight the idea of Korean unification. The North Koreans sent down the president's, the dictator's sister, Kim, I think her name is Kim Jong-yo or something like that, and that, you know, the press was going gaga over her. And in the midst of all this, you've got Vice President Pence over there, this disgruntled, angry man who's just constantly repeating the need for more sanctions, more brutal sanctions, and all military options are on the table throughout the Olympic Games while he was there. I think that this whole episode, Richard, really reflects the bankruptcy of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, you know, the right-wing press is over there making a big deal of this totalitarian regime. It's brutal. It tortures people. We all know that. I mean, that's no surprise. This is a communist regime. But on the other side, where does that justify U.S. interventionism? I mean, there's a lot of brutal regimes in the world, many of which the U.S. has installed into power. They don't seem to have any trouble with them. I mean, look at the Egyptian military dictatorship. I mean, a brutal military dictatorship, unelected, won't let people stand for office to run for president, suppresses people, censors people. Really no different in principle than the Korean dictatorship. Or Vietnam. I mean, you know, Vietnam's run by a communist regime, and I don't see very many, you know, right-wingers saying we need to go and help the South Vietnamese from this brutal tyranny in Vietnam. And then you've got the brutal dictatorships that the U.S. has installed historically in Iran with the Shah, the Guatemalan military dictatorship, the Chilean military dictatorship. And let's face it, Iraq and Afghanistan are run by brutal dictatorships as well. They may be elected, but many times the elections are just false and fraudulent. We all know that. So there's a lot of hypocrisy here. Not only does the North Korean dictatorial regime does not justify U.S. interventionism, a la John Quincy Adams' famous speech in 1821, that America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, and that includes, of course, communist monsters or monstrous regimes. And then there's the hypocrisy element of this, where the U.S. not only backs and supports strong totalitarian dictatorships that happen to be pro-U.S. government, but also installs many of them and then later enforces them. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I sort of want to perhaps preface your remarks with sort of the context of the Olympics themselves. The spirit or the idea of the Olympics, of course, dates from the imagery of the ancient Greeks. and how they would have these competitions of prowess and physical excellence. And then in the late 19th century, these were revived as an event for what became what we now call the Summer Olympics, the Winter Olympics. And it was meant to be a competition among the physically best and the brightest among the various citizens of the world. It was supposed to be non-political. It was supposed to be a celebration of people of all countries coming together and demonstrating the competition among humanity. But very shortly after its establishment, it became completely politicized. Governments began endorsing, supporting, certainly in the 20th century financially, covering many, if not most, if not all, the expenses of the training from the age of from the participants being little kids, such as was done particularly in the communist countries, in the Soviet bloc, and this idea of your team is your nation's identity. Your team represents a competition on the international stage to make your country look good and better than other countries around the world, and the pressure that would be put on people. Maybe some of the viewers and listeners remember a movie from, I guess it's the 1980s now, time flies, Chariots of Fire, which is about the Paris Olympics of the mid-1920s. And the British had a member on the running team. I forget the distance. A man named Little. He was a minister, I believe, of the Anglican Church from Scotland. And he was supposed to participate in one of the contests on a Sunday. Well, Sunday is God's day. And he said, I can't compete. I can't compete. And so the pressure has to be put on because the world appearance of Great Britain as a success is at stake. They even called in the Duke of Edinburgh, Duke of Windsor, to talk with him. You have a duty to your king. You have a duty to your country. Now, this Mr. Little actually said, I have a higher duty, and that is to my God, who's above both king and country. And he chose not to run. But that just shows that imagery in that movie of the idea that the team does not represent excellence of humanity peacefully competing in the achievements of sports, but rather it's politicized. Now, as I said, this has become notorious with doping. Even today with Russia, it certainly occurred notoriously in the Soviet bloc countries of the 1960s and 70s with various types of injections and so on. But the fact is that this is another instance. The American team represents America. Vice President Pence is there not just as a private person attending some sports events. He's there representing the United States, backing the American team. And therefore, America must state its principles, values, and goals in the arena of the Olympics to let everybody know what America stands for politically and diplomatically, and who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. It is totally politicized. The fact is that the North Koreans are using this for their own propaganda purposes. It's an attempt to make a wedge between the United States and the South Korean government in the context of Trump talking tough and the South Korean government seemingly going along with this, and to sort of break the way the South Koreans from their, quote, American masters as Pyongyang views it. At the same time, the South Koreans want to have some type of détente, whether successful or not, whether limited or not, because they would be in the immediate front rows of any military conflict between the United States and North Korea. Seoul, Korea is just miles away from the demilitarized zone separating the two Koreas. Whether it be conventional weapons or, shockingly, some type of nuclear weapon, Seoul, with its millions of peoples, would be in the immediate harm's way of a military conflict. As well as, to be honest, would be Japan. Certainly the North Korean missiles, assuming they could not be successfully interdicted, could raise havoc with cities, including Tokyo in Japan. And the United States comes along in this and says implicitly, we have to be tough. We're going to stop the nuclearization of North Korea, even if it runs the risk, the brinksmanship of a threat of a military conflict, the effect of which would fall upon the immediate neighbors and not the United States. So this is just an instance of the United States government using another arena of public celebrity for its own political agenda. The fact is the United States, if it's going to have an involvement, should have allowed this to be a basis of diffusing the thing. Pence would not meet with any member of the North Korean delegation, not even the sister of Kim Jong-un. Why not? Trump himself said earlier that he'd be happy to meet with the North Korean tyrant. Probably feels some simpatico for him in some way, perhaps. But the fact is that this is just a political arena for the United States to play tough again and insist that the world play according to the American rules and that the rules lead to the outcome that the United States government wants. It has nothing to do with sportsmanship, global competition and camaraderie. It's the politicization of everything, including the sports games of the Olympics, even more than they are already.
Yeah, I think it's important that we keep in mind that we're really talking about one country, and that's Korea. This is essentially a civil war that's taking place between two halves of the same country. And the United States government never had any business being involved in somebody else's civil war. It was none of their business from the very beginning. You go back all the way to the 1950s. But this, of course, was the era of the Cold War, where the communists are coming to get us. The dominoes are going to fall. And it was all this hyper danger type mindset that was created among the American people to justify the ever-increasing budgets of the military-industrial complex. So they always had to have this big official enemy. Well, you know, the Cold War ended in 1989. The question is, why are U.S. troops still in Korea? And I suggest that it's partly because the national security establishment here in the United States has never been able to give up its Cold War mindset. That for many of these people, the Cold War never ended. I mean, you can see it with respect to their mindset toward Russia and all this anti-Russia hoopla during the Trump administration. You see it with the embargo against Cuba. You see it now with what's going on in Korea. Now, the Koreans are as you know, Richard, a poor, impoverished third world country. I mean, they're probably closer to collapse than any other regime in the world. They put a lot of their resources, just like the U.S. does, into the military. Why do they do that? Well, there's no indication that they intend to start a war with the United States. There's not any indication they intend to start a war with the southern part of the country. I think they're smart. Kim Jong-un is not a dumb guy. He knows that in any war with the United States, North Korea loses automatically. It will be flattened. Even if there's no resort to nuclear weapons, conventionally speaking, this poor, impoverished third world country doesn't stand a chance against the most powerful military in history. He knows that. He has no incentive to start a war with the U.S. He also has no incentive to start a war with South Korea, even if the U.S. wasn't involved. South Korea is very prosperous. They're very dynamic. They can withstand a longer war much better than the North can. And even though the North can devastate Seoul with missiles and so forth, the outcome, assuming China doesn't get involved, is never in doubt. South Korea would end up defeating North Korea in a war. So everything points to the fact that North Korea just wants to be left alone. That it wants that ruling regime wants to remain in power, wants to continue controlling things there, along with all the privileges that come with political control. What's the threat they're facing? Well, it's the same threat that Cuba's faced, that Iraq faced, that Guatemala, Iran, Chile, and a number of other countries. They face regime change on the part of the U.S. government. either with an invasion or a coup or an assassination. I mean, this has been one of the core elements of U.S. foreign policy since the federal government was converted to a national security state after World War II. Regime change. And they've made it very clear that North Korea is on their list of nations to be targeted for regime change. You know, the axis of evil and so forth. Well, there's only one way to protect against a regime change, and that's through having a nuclear capability. If the U.S. knows that North Korea can, let's say, wipe out San Francisco, then regime change might become a little bit more costly, might deter them from initiating a regime change operation. And the North Koreans are not dumb. They saw what happened in Iraq, for example, where Iraq doesn't have any kind of nuclear deterrent. It, too, was a poor third world country, didn't stand a chance against the military. Regime change was effected. They see what happened in Cuba. Castro brings in nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. Why? Not to start a war with the United States, but to stop the Pentagon and the CIA from again invading Cuba. And it worked. As soon as Kennedy vowed that the U.S. would not invade Cuba, the missiles were taken out. And that's what I think is lost in all this among many Americans. You know, you see it in the mainstream press. Oh, this is an aggressive regime. It's so aggressive you can tell by its nuclear capability. But aggressive meaning what? Meaning that they want to defend themselves against a U.S. invasion. And that's, in the minds of many Americans, the right wing, that's a crime. That you're not supposed to defend yourself or to try to deter a U.S. invasion. We see it in Iraq, where the U.S. invades a country that never attacked the United States, clear war of aggression, and yet when people defend themselves in Iraq against this type of an invasion, they're terrorists, they need to be killed, and they need to have their country destroyed. You just don't defend against a U.S. invasion. And that's really what this is all about. The only real solution is for the U.S. just to butt out. I mean, this has been, it's been a Budinsky interventionist foreign policy. Just bring the troops home and leave Korea to the Koreans. Sort of laissez-faire, laissez-passer in foreign policy. Korea belongs to the Koreans. Let them work it out. If it happens to turn into war, that's their business, just like our Civil War was our business.
Well, I think that the mindset that is guiding this, and it reflects what you've been saying about the United States government's foreign policy since the end of the Second World War, is a word that conservatives cringe at when it refers to the United States, but is no less the case: empire. Now, it is true that the imagery of empire usually connotes like what Great Britain or France had in the 19th and first half of the 20th century, where you control directly, politically, huge swathes of territory around the world. The British Empire at one time included approximately 1/4 of all the landmass of the world, if you consider all the parts of Africa, of India and Pakistan as today, and other areas. And the idea that therefore that other parts of the world are directly under the military and political administration of the home country. And it's true, the United States does not have that. But if you look at a variation of that, the degree of American diplomatic and military influence and presence and ability to nudge and direct what many governments have done or said in the past, continue to say and do in the present, you realize that the United States is a global empire by other means than the old traditional one of occupying a country and then directly politically administering it and controlling it from the home country's capital. And this is the mindset that has dominated, as you were saying, since the end of the Second World War. There was this image, classical liberals and libertarians choose to differ from it, but we're talking about the image that they had, that America's turning its back on the world after the First World War set the stage for all the madness that occurred in the 1930s, the aggressive Japanese, the dictatorial and brutal Nazis, and that America therefore had to do what it had failed to do in 1919, engage with the world. And by engaging with the world, America has to show its leadership, its presence, its role. in directing the world towards democracy, freedom. And then in the ashes of the Second World War, who's left standing? The United States and a heavily economically and militarily weakened, but in comparison to Britain or France, unbelievably strong Soviet Union. And now America has to be the guardian of the world, not now that Nazism is dead, against communism. And this requires, as John Kennedy said in his speeches, it's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, because America has to man the ramparts of freedom virtually everywhere in the world. And that philosophy that was expressed in those attitudes of the individual towards the state in general and the role of the individual in the state in global affairs reflected what had been American policy beginning with Roosevelt and then Truman, and then ever since Kennedy was assassinated. It's the continuity of these policies. Now, I know you're a great expert on the Kennedy assassination, and you believe that Kennedy was attempting to follow a slightly different route. But the fact is, his political statements, and the ones that have continued to resonate in the attitudes of the policymakers in guiding American policy, are those statements that he made in addresses during his presidency. America's role, America's duty, America's responsibility, and the sacrifice of the individual to serve these global responsibilities. And that is the mentality that continues to pervade today, with the attitudes for even under the supposedly peaceful Obama administration following the aggressive Bush invading Afghanistan and Iraq, and now continues with Trump. This idea that America is the policeman of the world, the gendarme of the globe, and the world will be endangered with God knows what threats unless America continues to play this role. And even as other countries grow and become politically and economically and militarily stronger on the international scene, particularly China, it is called upon the United States to be that bulwark to see that the world reflects what are the true and right values, and that's America's. Now, I happen to think that a lot of what America has historically stood for is right and true. Individual freedom, private property, constitutionally limited government, rule of law. But in playing this role of global policeman, it is required that very government to violate and weaken the Constitution, both at home and abroad, to play its role as empire maker. And that's the dilemma we face.
Oh, you're right. I mean, Kennedy comes into office giving as a standard Cold Warrior, pretty much standard Cold Warrior. He didn't buy into this notion that nationalist movements that were really anti-British Empire, as you pointed out about the British Empire, extended all across the world, and there was revolutionary movements after the World War II to evict the British Empire from these lands. And they were viewed as communists, pro-communist movements. And Kennedy came into office as pretty much a Cold Warrior, but didn't buy into this notion that these nationalist movements were necessarily pro-communist. But Richard, the big shift in Kennedy took place at the peace speech. Well, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the military and the CIA were exhorting him to invade Cuba, and instead he strikes a deal with the communists that says we won't invade Cuba. And then that famous peace speech at American University where he says, and this is what got him killed, is this shift that took place, this breakthrough that took place where he said, you know what, we can live in peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. We can work together with these totalitarian regimes. We don't have to be at war with them. Now, that's anathema to the Cold War military, CIA, NSA establishment. Even among the right wing, that was the shibboleth. You cannot live in peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. Here's a president that's saying we're going to. Now, what would that have done in Korea? Well, what do you need troops for in Korea if you're living in peaceful harmony with this communist totalitarian regime? And so, not surprisingly, every president since Kennedy has gone back to that original vision of, oh, we've got to stop the communist threat, we've got to stop these monsters around the world, and we need, as you point out, a new empire, an American empire, what Chalmers Johnson called an empire of military bases all around the world. to maintain control. And the model really is the Soviet model, where the Soviet Union had, they didn't put in Russians to control Czechoslovakia, Poland, or East Germany. They used their local lackeys there, their puppets. They would take orders from Moscow, and that's really the model that the U.S. has copied. They put their lackeys, like the Shah of Iran or Pinochet in Chile. Saddam Hussein was one of their lackeys, partners and allies. Now, I think we should also emphasize the role of sanctions in all this. I mean, this is a brutal mechanism. It is intended to cause the populace of a country to starve to death or to die of infectious illnesses and diseases. We saw this in Iraq when they were trying to oust Saddam Hussein from power throughout the 90s. They were using sanctions against the Iraqi children, knowing that they were killing hundreds of thousands of children. And then you've got this indifference, conscious indifference to the deaths when Madeleine Albright is asked by 60 Minutes whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children is worth it. She says, oh, well, the issue's a tough one, but yes, it's worth it. And that's really what they're trying to do with these sanctions against North Korea. They're trying to kill ordinary people. And I think that's one of the reasons why Pence had to go over there. They need to depersonalize the North Korean people. The last thing they want is for Americans to see those cheerleaders and to see this woman who's the sister of this dictator and see them in a personal sense. That we've got to dehumanize them, you know, just like in Vietnam, that they're all Reds, they're all communists, or when the U.S. drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they're all Japs, they're all the same. And so I think this is where we really also need to question this foreign policy: is why should the U.S. government be trying to kill people with sanctions? You know, where is the morality of that? This whole concept of sanctions. It is a brutal system. You know, when they talk about the brutality of the North Korean regime, and it certainly is brutal. It's a communist dictatorship. But we've got to look at the brutality of the U.S. government. While socialism in North Korea kills multitudes of people, you've got the U.S. government saying, well, let's pile on and let's kill even more people in the hopes that they will revolt or in the hopes that their dictator gives in. Well, the dictator's not going to give in any more than the U.S. would give in if hundreds of thousands of American children were being killed by some foreign regime. Rulers don't give in to those kind of threats. And it's time for, I think, Richard, for the U.S. to the American people to really question not only the interventionism, not only the installation and enforcement of brutal military regimes and dictatorships, but also this whole idea of sanctions that is designed to kill the populace as a way to get to the ruler.
Yeah, we ought to understand also as a complement to that, and I was alluding to that, where this drive for empire necessarily undermines the liberty and the rights of the American citizenry as part of the cost of this global presence. And one form of this is precisely the sanctions. It is true that the sanctions have as their goal to weaken the regime that's being targeted, with the belief that a method of weakening that government is to impose austerity on the local population, even more than the corrupt and misplaced policies of its own government is doing, particularly in a system that continues to model itself after Stalinist socialist central planning. But we should not forget that there's another side of it. Those sanctions also say Americans may not trade with the people in that country or the government of that country. They may not travel to that country. They may not form peaceful connections or associations with any of the individuals in that country. So in other words, in the name of sanctioning that foreign government and imposing these types of punishments that you referred to on the citizens of that foreign government, it requires the restriction of the liberty of the American citizens as well. They can't buy and sell. They can't travel. They can't interact. They can't associate. They can't get a passport permission to visit that country unless the State Department defines it as an exceptional circumstance that the U.S. government deems as okay for a visitor to go to that country. You were traveling to Cuba when these restrictions on travel to Cuba were stronger than they are even today under Trump. You had to get personal permission, a special exemption from the State Department. As an American citizen, you couldn't just apply for a visa from the Cuban government, get your ticket, and fly there. You also had to get approval from the U.S. government. These narrow and restrict and hamper the liberties of Americans as well in the name of trying to change regimes abroad that brings terrible hardships on the people of that country and the people of that country who are already oppressed by their own government.
Yeah, and it really is pathetic, these sanctions, like in the case of the Korean Olympics. Samsung was scared to give smartphones to the North Korean athletes because they might violate the sanctions and the U.S. might come after them. How pathetic is that? And yet it's justified because the U.S. would go after Samsung. They'd start fining them. They'd start trying to bankrupt them. They would do anything they could to retaliate with the same viciousness that the North Korean system has against its own people. And we saw this when the Iraq sanctions. There was a guy named Bert Sachs from Washington State who went over and violated the sanctions by taking medicines into the Iraqi people. Medicines, Richard. The State Department or the Treasury Department fined him, I think, $10,000 and pursued him to collect that fine for, 10 years. And to Sachs's everlasting credit, he fought him every step of the way, and he said, I will never apologize for taking medicines into people just because they're violating your stupid sanctions. And he ended up winning. So you've got these pathetic examples of these sanctions where independent regimes or independent countries are scared to death of angering the U.S. And as you point out, it's a direct violation of our own liberty. But it really goes back, Richard, to the whole conversion of the federal government to a national security state. If you look at North Korea, its system of government, a national security state, is no different in principle from the U.S. They have their CIA, they have their NSA, they have their giant military establishment, they have their military parades just like Trump wants to have. It's that conversion to a totalitarian structure in the name of fighting totalitarianism that really is the root of the problem. It leads to enforcing sanctions that violate our own freedom, of having surveillance schemes that violate our own privacy. It really is a violation of everything Americans stand for, and it constitutes a destruction of our own liberty and our own prosperity here at home.
Yes, I think that this imagery that Trump wants to have a military parade down Pennsylvania Avenue at some notable date, I guess he'd like to have it on the 4th of July. The Pentagon has suggested November because it will be the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. But the thing is that, as a number of historians have recently highlighted, America has had military parades at the end of the American Civil War in Washington, D.C., at marking the end of the First and Second World War. Whether good or bad, these have been considered exceptions. America is a country that places civilians above the military. It's a country that views peace and trade and individual rights above national greatness and empire, historically, traditionally, at least in principle or sentiment, when in fact it has not always done so. But Trump goes to this parade in Paris, marking Bastille Day, and he's ooh and ah. Now, why do the French have this? Because they cannot accept the fact that Napoleon lost, that their empire is gone. Face the facts, live with it, get on, move on, get a life. The French can't do this. So they have to have these military parades to symbolize the fact that they still have this outreach, both culturally, linguistically, and militarily, especially in their former colonies in West Africa. They're always militarily intervening in. You read this all the time in the press. How is that any different than saying, you know what, we need to model our parade after the communists in China, or the Soviets are now continuing the Russians under Putin in Moscow? This is just a grandstanding of, we're strong. We have the power to impose our might and our will on others through the threat of violence. I mean, what? No, he says it's to show respect and appreciation for those who have served in the military in the United States. Now, regardless of the motive and the circumstances, many Americans have honestly and sincerely joined the military and served during wartime because they believed it was the right thing to do. I don't condemn them. In fact, I appreciate the sentiment and the ideal behind which they thought they were doing the right thing. But I think you don't honor these people, regardless of the rightness of the conflict that they were in. I don't believe you honor the living or the dead by having military parades that hallmark a love for more violence. You should be doing it through peaceful remembrances to ask ourselves the question, what were the causes of the conflict that made us have these tragic losses of the dead, of the injured, those who survive but carry it with them for the end of their days, and to rethink the place of America in the world, and one that should be more peaceful, non-interventionist, but open to all through freedom, trade, culture, and exchange.
Yeah, it's really funny. The most humorous part, one of the most humorous parts of the Olympics was when the press goes up to Pence and they ask him for a comment about North Korea's military parade that they had like on the first day of the Olympics. And he says, oh, this is just standard, communism, militarism. This is a military nation. They're just highlighting their militarism with this parade. Then they said, well, how about Trump's idea for a parade? And of course, he was scared to death. Pence was scared to death to even intimate any implicit criticism of his boss. He might get fired too. He says, oh, no, Trump's parade is different. Come on. It would be the exact same thing. It would be like those Soviet parades where the tanks go down the boulevard, or the North Korean parade. This has become a military nation. The national security establishment is the most prominent, predominant, powerful part of the federal government. Foreign interventionism and foreign empire are the most dominating feature of the U.S. government. And that's what Trump's going to be highlighting, the militarist nature of the U.S. government, which is contrary, as you have pointed out, Richard, to the founding principle of this country, which was a constitutionally limited government republic. No CIA, no NSA, no giant military establishment, no military-industrial complex. That was the founding principle. And anyway, Richard, we're out of time. As always, greatly enjoyed the conversation, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next week, thanks to the viewers and listeners for spending some time with us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, and come and see us at fff.org. Subscribe to our free FFF Daily. It features a weekly article by Richard, my daily blog, and many other sound, uncompromising perspectives on liberty and libertarianism. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week.